In early 2024, everyday life across Israel felt deceptively ordinary. Beaches bustled in Tel Aviv. Cafes hummed in Haifa. Even in Jerusalem, despite its volatile core, daily life rolled on with a cautious rhythm. Beneath that surface calm, however, Israel's security community was growing increasingly unsettled. Intelligence analysts at IDF headquarters had been watching Iran with growing unease. Satellite images showed new activity at 2 Revolutionary Guard air bases in western Iran, missile systems being repositioned in daylight, aircraft running at night without declared drills, and intercepted communications hinting at joint coordination with regional militias. It wasn't business as usual. Something was shifting. By March, Mossad briefings quietly warned of synchronized Iranian staging, a phrase used to signal that multiple IRGC assets might be preparing for action, possibly even a direct strike. That kind of assault was once unthinkable. Iran typically operated through proxies: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, armed groups in Syria and Iraq. Tehran had never openly launched an attack on Israeli soil. But the signals this time didn't match past patterns. Within Israel's defense circles, simulations ran almost daily. One confidential exercise, leaked weeks later, projected an Iranian barrage of over 200 drones and missiles in under 3 hours. The outcome: Israel's Iron Dome and other layers of air defense could intercept most, but not all. Civilian infrastructure could still take a hit. The economic and emotional shock would be enormous. Yet to the public, everything appeared normal. President Isaac Cohen, fictional name used for dramatization, attended memorial events. His televised speeches made no mention of threats. Still, his schedule told a different story. A European diplomatic trip was abruptly canceled. 3 national security briefings were added in a single week. Inside the Knesset, lawmakers noticed an uptick in closed-door sessions. Israel's military, meanwhile, quietly transitioned into live alert. Air defense operators were ordered into rotational shifts around the clock. At Dimona, Israel's nuclear research site, drills were activated under the radar. The term readiness only became common, but no official explanations followed. In Washington, U.S. officials saw the same warning signs. CENTCOM shifted assets closer to the Gulf. High-level coordination with Israeli command began under urgent timelines. American bombers quietly moved to strategic positions. Still, the wider world was largely distracted by inflation, elections, and Ukraine. Even most Israelis didn't grasp the gravity. Polls showed overwhelming confidence in national security. The looming threat wasn't part of daily conversations. For now, calm prevailed. But that calm was brittle. On April 10th, Iran's supreme leader issued a chilling line: "There will come a night when the oppressor will not sleep." That warning wasn't metaphorical. It was a countdown. 3 days later, on April 13th, just after 9 p.m., radar screens across Israel lit up. The attack had begun. On the night of April 13th, 2024, at precisely 9:03 p.m. local time, a dense pulse of signals jammed airspace monitors across the Middle East. It took less than 2 minutes for Israeli defense systems to confirm what had begun. Nearly 350 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic projectiles were launched in coordinated waves from Iranian territory, targeting Israeli infrastructure, military bases, and population centers. It was a moment no one under 50 had lived through: a direct, open military strike from Iran on Israel. Codenamed by Tehran as Operation True Promise, the attack marked the first time since the Islamic Revolution that Iran engaged Israel head-on, bypassing proxies. Iranian state TV aired animated graphics in real time, hailing the operation as historic retribution. In the background, images of Gaza's rubble played, Tehran casting the strike as vengeance for the deaths of Iranian military advisors in Damascus earlier that month, and symbolically, for decades of conflict across the region. But symbolism aside, the sheer scale of the attack stunned analysts. Hundreds of projectiles launched almost simultaneously from multiple Iranian sites. It was a calculated saturation, too many to be intercepted easily, and meant to push Israel's multi-tiered defense grid to its limit. The Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow systems locked on. Dozens of interceptors screamed through the night sky. The air lit up like an invisible war had taken visible shape. Israel's military command declared a nationwide emergency within 20 minutes. Sirens blared from Eilat in the south to Kiryat Shmona in the north. Civilians scrambled for bomb shelters. In cities like Tel Aviv and Ashkelon, residents captured footage of interceptors streaking overhead and distant booms lighting the horizon. Though most missiles were destroyed mid-air, some slipped through, damaging airstrips, communication towers, and a military base near Beersheba. In the command bunker near Tel Aviv, Israeli leadership watched the strike unfold in real time. Prime Minister Reuben Halati, fictionalized name, flanked by defense chiefs, maintained a calm front for the media. But intelligence officers were already projecting potential escalations. Would Hezbollah join next? Were Iraqi militias preparing rocket launches? Was this the opening of a wider multi-front war? By midnight, Israel's cabinet authorized proportional retaliation. Not full escalation, just enough to signal deterrence. Within 48 hours on April 19th, Israeli aircraft responded with a targeted strike on an Iranian air defense radar site near Isfahan, deep inside Iranian territory. No casualties were reported, and Tehran downplayed the damage. But the message was unmistakable. Deterrence had teeth. International reactions were swift. President Biden convened the National Security Council within hours of the Iranian launch. The U.S., UK, and France condemned Iran's actions, affirming Israel's right to defend itself. NATO didn't intervene militarily, but the alliance issued a strongly worded statement denouncing Tehran. Arab nations, including the UAE and Bahrain, called for de-escalation, but noticeably avoided direct criticism of Israel. Jordan closed its airspace to Iranian aircraft, fearing spillover. And yet, not all responses went as Tel Aviv had expected. In a closed-door meeting at the UN Security Council, several non-Western states, including Brazil and India, urged restraint from both parties. China and Russia condemned the violence, but pointed fingers at the cycle of provocation, implying Israel had a share in fueling the escalation. On social media, #NoToWar trended across Europe and North America, revealing a weariness among global citizens for yet another Middle East conflict. Back in Israel, the public mood was defiant but rattled. Air raid shelters remained open for days. Schools were closed in several regions. In synagogues and cafes, the conversation was no longer if another attack would come, but when and from where. The illusion of invincibility, long built on Iron Dome's performance, had cracked. The fear wasn't just about the next missile. It was about what Israel's leadership would do next. Rumors began circulating about an unusual development that President Isaac Cohen, fictionalized, had quietly left the country just hours before the Iranian strike. The Prime Minister's office denied it. Officials claimed he was conducting urgent diplomatic outreach in Europe, securing international backing in case of further escalation. But the optics were unsettling. A nation under fire, and its president absent in its most vulnerable hour? In media circles, debates erupted. Was it a precautionary move or a crisis of confidence? Had the threat been more severe than publicly admitted? Was there a deeper fracture in Israel's top leadership? Meanwhile, Iran celebrated. State outlets broadcasted crowds chanting in Tehran, claiming victory. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement warning of further measures if Israel retaliated. But Tehran was also cautious. Despite its boast, it had no interest in a full-scale war. Their operation had made history, but also raised the stakes beyond what many in Iran's government were ready to face. By the week's end, both nations had pulled back from a brink. The skies went quiet again, for now. But trust, once shaken, doesn't restore overnight. And beneath the silence, a new era had begun. The message was clear. This was not proxy warfare anymore. The days following the Iranian attack were tense and uncertain. while Israeli jets had launched a limited response, and both sides were publicly claiming victory without escalating further. The streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa told a different story. Anxiety clung to conversations. News tickers pulsed with speculation. Military analysts debated whether this was the beginning of a long war or the final flare of one. But beneath the visible fear, another question began to dominate headlines, one far more personal and unsettling. Where was the president? Isaac Cohen, Israel's sitting head of state, was noticeably absent from the public eye. While the prime minister had addressed the nation twice within 48 hours of the strike, his face firm, his voice measured, President Cohen had not appeared on live television, had issued no national address, and was reportedly in Europe conducting diplomacy. That phrasing, carefully chosen by the president's office, did little to ease public concern. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into pointed questions. Opposition figures in the Knesset demanded transparency. The people deserve to know where their president is, one member declared in a televised hearing. We are under attack. If the symbolic head of state cannot stand with the people, what message does that send? Soon, reports surfaced that President Cohen had boarded a government aircraft hours before the attack began, not after, as previously claimed. Sources inside Ben Gurion Airport confirmed that flight logs showed a diplomatic aircraft lifting off at 8:41 p.m. on April 13th, 22 minutes before the first wave of drones entered Israeli airspace. The timeline didn't add up. If the attack came as a surprise, why had the president already been evacuated? Some argued it was a routine precaution, a standard protocol for leadership continuity. But others saw it differently, as a vote of no confidence in the country's defense, or worse, as abandonment. Editorials in major Israeli papers asked pointedly, if the president had intelligence of an incoming strike significant enough to justify evacuation, why was the public not warned in the same breath? Social media only deepened the divide. On X, formerly Twitter, threads speculated everything from health emergencies to hidden threats. Hashtags like #WhereIsCohen and #PresidentInExile began trending in Israel and abroad. Protesters gathered in Tel Aviv with signs reading, "We stayed. He left." The Prime Minister's office attempted to control the damage, stating that President Cohen was in Berlin meeting with key European leaders to coordinate diplomatic backing and ensure support in case of regional escalation. But this explanation, while plausible on paper, lacked one key ingredient: visibility. There were no official photographs, no clips of the president shaking hands, no press conferences, nothing but silence. In Berlin, German officials confirmed that Israeli diplomatic envoys had met with their defense ministry. But when asked about the president's presence, they offered no comment. That ambiguity only intensified suspicion. Israeli journalists based in Europe searched for clues, staking out embassies and hotels. No confirmed sightings were reported. If the president was indeed in Europe, he was nowhere to be seen. Back home, the emotional temperature continued rising. In religious communities, rabbis warned of a spiritual vacuum at the nation's helm. In secular circles, the concern was more practical. If leadership fractures this early in the conflict, how would Israel navigate the next strike, the next alliance, the next war? For families huddled in bomb shelters days earlier, the issue wasn't about protocol. It was about presence. In moments of fear, symbols matter. And the symbol of a president missing in action was damaging. Behind closed doors, several members of the National Security Council reportedly urged President Cohen to return immediately and address the public. The silence is worse than any mistake, one insider told the Israeli press on background. People will forgive fear. They won't forgive vanishing. Finally, on April 21st, 8 days after the attack, President Cohen appeared in a brief video statement. Filmed in an undisclosed location, possibly in Zurich based on digital metadata later uncovered by journalists, he addressed the nation for under 3 minutes. His tone was measured, but his appearance lacked the conviction many hoped for. Israel will always act with courage and unity, he said, reading from prepared remarks. I have been working tirelessly to secure international guarantees for our nation's protection and resilience. In the coming days, I will return to Israel and meet with our people. Together, we will prevail. There were no questions, no mention of why he had left, no apology, just words, too few, and too late for some. In the Knesset, calls grew louder for a parliamentary inquiry. Meanwhile, within the IDF's upper ranks, morale was split. Some commanders saw Cohen's departure as a calculated strategic move, a necessity in case the political leadership was decapitated by a first strike. Others felt betrayed, quietly questioning if loyalty to a nation should not include standing beside it when missiles fall. What remained clear was this: the Israeli public's trust had been shaken, not just in their defense systems or in regional alliances, but in the presence of their highest symbolic leader. Operation True Promise had changed more than airspace maps or defense budgets. It had exposed vulnerabilities that no missile could reach, the fault lines within national leadership, and the expectations of its citizens. And those cracks, once exposed, do not easily disappear. While Israel's internal questions began boiling over across the Persian Gulf, Tehran was quiet, but not idle. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard's top brass monitored every Israeli news segment, every Western headline, and every military movement from afar. They saw the protests. They noted the hashtags. They read the editorials asking, "Where is the president?" And perhaps most importantly, they saw hesitation, an unspoken uncertainty taking root inside Israel's leadership structure. For the architects of Operation True Promise, this was not just satisfying. It was strategic leverage. Within days of the April 13th to 14th strikes, Iranian state media began amplifying the narrative abroad, not through crude propaganda, but with precision. Official outlets like Press TV and IRNA published reports quoting Western media coverage, emphasizing Israel's political instability. Even Israel's highest office chose absence over resistance. One headline read, "Carefully calibrated for international consumption." Western governments may support Tel Aviv, but its people now question their own leadership. This narrative wasn't just for domestic consumption. Tehran's goal was international, to shift perception. In Middle Eastern capitals, from Beirut to Baghdad, Tehran's diplomats quietly made the case that Iran's strike was not reckless aggression, but a measured response. "We warned," said Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian in a closed-door briefing in Oman. "They ignored us. Now, they understand we are not to be dismissed." Meanwhile, inside Iran's command circles, discussions focused on what not to do. The Guard's elite cyber division launched a brief wave of disinformation campaigns online, but quickly pulled back. There was no need to muddy the waters. Israel was struggling to control its own story. Any further interference could appear obvious, less powerful than letting the narrative crumble under its own weight. Strategically, Iran held back. No follow-up strikes. No belligerent speeches. No nuclear provocations. The silence was unnerving and deliberate. Instead of escalation, Iran began making quiet diplomatic overtures to countries long hesitant to pick sides. Delegations were sent to Ankara, Doha, and even Cairo. The message was clear: we defended ourselves. Now we are offering to de-escalate for stability. And while Iranian leaders said the word de-escalate, they didn't stop preparing. Satellite images showed heightened activity around multiple military installations near Shiraz, Isfahan, and Bandar Abbas. Dozens of air defense units were repositioned. Naval vessels in the Persian Gulf adjusted their patterns. None of it looked like retreat. It looked like readiness, waiting. Inside the region, proxy groups celebrated the pause as a moment of validation. Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah gave a televised speech days after the Israeli counterstrike, praising Iran's historic courage, while subtly warning Israel not to test the resolve of the wider resistance. The tone was triumphant, but restrained. In Tehran's academic and policy circles, analysts debated the next move. Was this the high-water mark of confrontation? Would Israel risk another retaliation if no further attacks came from Iran? Or had Iran achieved something far more valuable than military victory? Psychological parody? One influential conservative columnist wrote, "For the first time, Tel Aviv blinked." They responded, "Yes, but with hesitation, with limits." And when their people needed a symbol of strength, they found a plane ticket and silence. This is not just deterrence. This is doubt, now seated in their public consciousness. Still, there were concerns. Some within Iran's reformist press warned that complacency could invite miscalculation. "We cannot mistake quiet for peace," one editorial cautioned. Israel's pause may be tactical. The United States has not stepped back, and our enemies do not forget. Behind the curtain of public restraint, the Revolutionary Guard intensified meetings with militia groups in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The goal was not another wave of attacks, but positioning. Be ready was the message, not go now. In Washington, officials noticed the shift. Satellite intelligence, diplomatic backchannels, and cyber traffic painted a clear picture. Iran was content to watch, for now. U.S. Secretary of Defense issued a subtle warning in a press briefing. "We remain vigilant. Our support for Israel's security is unwavering. But we encourage all actors in the region to consider the consequences of further escalation." Back in Israel, intelligence officials were split. Some believed Tehran had achieved its objective: demonstrate reach, sow doubt, retreat before consequences. Others warned that the quiet was temporary, that Iran would strike again once global attention waned. But one thing they all agreed on: Iran was calculating, not chaotic. The contrast between the two nations was stark. In Israel, citizens debated leadership. In Iran, leaders analyzed opportunity. In Tel Aviv, the government scrambled to regain control of the narrative. In Tehran, the narrative was already shaped, and it didn't need more missiles to maintain its momentum. What came next would depend less on weaponry than on perception. And in the quiet corridors of Tehran's Ministry of Intelligence, one senior analyst reportedly summarized it best to a Western intermediary: "You think we wanted war? No. We wanted silence, on our terms. And now the world is watching you unravel your own stability." Whether that prediction would hold true was still uncertain. But for now, Iran had paused, not because it was afraid, because it believed it had already won the round. As regional tension hovered in uneasy stillness, the United States faced its own dilemma. Washington had long positioned itself as Israel's closest ally, but this time the terrain felt unfamiliar. Iran's bold maneuver was not followed by a flurry of threats. It was followed by silence. Israel, for the first time in years, was publicly doubting its own leadership. And in the backdrop, an American presidential election loomed just 5 months away. President Matthew Hale, in office since January 2021, stood at the podium flanked by defense and intelligence officials on April 20th, 6 days after Iran's strike. "The United States condemns this unprecedented act of aggression," he began. "We stand by the security of Israel, and we are coordinating with our allies to ensure regional stability." But something in the room felt off. The tone wasn't fire and fury, it was careful, measured, almost clinical. Inside the Situation Room, those close to the president were divided. Some pushed for a visible show of strength: deploy more assets to the Mediterranean, increase naval drills, signal overwhelming deterrence. Others warned that too much pressure could force Tehran into further escalation, risking a broader war, right as domestic approval ratings teetered near a 10-month low. Privately, the White House had already dispatched envoys to Qatar and Oman, trusted regional mediators. Their mission was simple: gauge Iran's mood. Were they done? Were they waiting? Or were they planning something worse? The answer was complicated. Iran's officials communicated indirectly. "We made our point," a senior Iranian diplomat reportedly told the Qatari delegation. "We do not seek to widen the field, but we will not stand still if provoked again." In other words, we've paused. That doesn't mean we've stopped. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence analysts dug deep into post-strike data. Their conclusion: Iran had deliberately held back on certain assets during Operation True Promise. No major strikes had been launched from its western air bases. Its most advanced ballistic systems were not used. Its cyber division, known for precision attacks on Israeli infrastructure in the past, remained largely dormant. To seasoned eyes, this was a message. Tehran had demonstrated what it could do, but it had also left room for future escalation. Washington interpreted that restraint not as weakness, but as a signal: we know what we're doing. Don't force us to show more. At the Pentagon, the mood was tense. Satellite surveillance intensified. U.S. Central Command quietly repositioned surveillance drones over Iranian airspace. Meanwhile, cybersecurity teams braced for retaliatory hacks, not from Iran's central government, but from its network of loosely affiliated cyber groups with track records of digital disruption. All of this unfolded as the American media machine turned its gaze toward the Israeli president's absence. "Where is the commander-in-chief?" one cable network anchor asked during a primetime segment. In leaked footage from Israel's own Knesset, a member of the opposition slammed the administration's silence, shouting, "Even Washington has responded more firmly than we have." That moment went viral, not just in Israel, but across the world. In Moscow, Chinese state television, and even Turkish late-night political satire, the message was the same. Israel's leadership looked shaken. And the United States was left juggling two images: its commitment to defending an ally, and its fear of being dragged into a regional war on the eve of an election. To make matters more delicate, protests flared in American cities. From New York to Los Angeles, activists criticized both Iran's aggression and Israel's retaliatory policies in Gaza. Some called on the Biden administration to show restraint, while others demanded a real response against Iran. The streets echoed with contradictions, and the administration heard them all. Within the CIA, analysts focused on a growing pattern. Iran wasn't behaving like a cornered rogue state. It was behaving like a state playing chess, not checkers. Tehran's leaders didn't want all-out war. They wanted to shape the narrative, undermine Israeli confidence, and gain diplomatic standing across the global south. At a confidential briefing to the Senate Intelligence Committee, one analyst summarized it bluntly: Tehran doesn't want to win a war. They want to make Israel look alone, and they want us to walk into the trap of escalation. In response, the White House approved a limited set of visible actions, without inviting escalation. An additional carrier group was sent to the eastern Mediterranean. F-22s were rotated into Qatar. Meanwhile, U.S. diplomats worked behind the scenes with European and Arab partners to draft a new resolution at the United Nations condemning both the original strike and any further provocations. But in the eyes of the public, the damage to Israel's image had already begun. President Hale's approval rating remained flat, but a new poll found that 47% of Americans believed the U.S. should prioritize de-escalation in the Middle East, compared to only 29% who favored a strong response to Iranian aggression. It was the clearest sign, yet Americans were tired of endless conflict, and Tehran knew it. By early May, the world had not seen another missile, not another drone. But no one believed the quiet was permanent. Because in this new kind of war, the war of perception, of resolve, of leadership, you don't need explosions to make history. Sometimes all it takes is silence. While Israel faced internal tremors, and Washington calculated every syllable, the rest of the Middle East was already moving. Countries that once kept their distance from Iran's ambitions were suddenly revisiting old alliances, reassessing priorities, and in some cases, quietly applauding Tehran's audacity. In Amman, the Jordanian Security Council convened an emergency session just 24 hours after the strike. Officially, Jordan condemned the attack, warning against actions that endanger regional stability. But unofficially, several intelligence sources confirmed what many already suspected. Jordan had been warned. Whether through back channels in Baghdad or hints dropped in Beirut, Amman had a window of foresight. Iran, it seemed, hadn't wanted to surprise everyone, just one country in particular. Saudi Arabia's response was even more layered. Publicly, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made a brief televised statement emphasizing the kingdom's commitment to regional peace and mutual respect among nations. But beneath that polished exterior was a long-term strategy recalibrating in real time. Over the past 2 years, Riyadh had been edging closer to détente with Tehran, brokered in large part through Chinese diplomacy. And while their shared history was stained with decades of rivalry, something about Iran's latest move appealed to Saudi strategic minds. Boldness without recklessness. Disruption without chaos. Iran hadn't leveled Tel Aviv. It had demonstrated range, capability, and restraint. That's the part Gulf leadership took note of. For the United Arab Emirates, the conversation was even more pragmatic. Abu Dhabi's financial sector had deep ties to both East and West. As markets jolted in response to news of the attack, investors scrambled to understand whether this was a flashpoint or a new phase. Emirati officials reassured foreign investors, this is posturing, not war. Yet behind those reassurances, diplomatic advisors were drafting updated contingency plans. Meanwhile, Egypt, historically seen as a stabilizing voice in the region, moved cautiously. Cairo's statement, released by the Foreign Ministry, urged maximum restraint from all parties, while its intelligence community reportedly offered to host indirect talks between Israeli and Iranian intermediaries. The offer, unsurprisingly, was ignored. But not everyone was interested in de-escalation. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's leadership viewed Iran's operation as validation. For years, Tehran had promised it would step up in defense of its allies. And now it had. This emboldened fringe factions in southern Lebanon, where skirmishes along the Israeli border flared more frequently. Iran's move had shifted the psychological calculus for these groups. If Tehran was now willing to act directly, that changed the entire game board. And that's where the risk grew exponentially. Small misfires from non-state actors, emboldened by perceived Iranian backing, could pull Israel into a deeper conflict, one it could no longer afford to fight on 2 or 3 fronts simultaneously. By the end of April, regional intelligence hubs, both Arab and Western, were seeing the same pattern, a subtle but unmistakable shift in posture across the Middle East. Not one defined by tanks or missiles, but by attitude. The notion of Israeli invincibility, long a psychological pillar in the region, was starting to erode. This wasn't about whether Israel could strike back. It could. It had. But for the first time, it had been hit directly, and the world had watched to see how it would respond. And many, quietly, were left underwhelmed. Turkey, watching carefully from the north, saw a geopolitical opportunity. President Erdogan, never one to shy from drama, used the moment to call for a regional defense pact, one that would exclude both Israel and Iran, and instead focus on Arab and Muslim-majority nations, ensuring their own collective security. While the proposal was largely symbolic, it added another layer of narrative, that Israel could no longer dictate the tone of the region's future. In Iraq, politicians divided sharply. Shiite blocs praised Iran's show of strength. Sunni leaders warned it would destabilize fragile economic gains. But even in Baghdad, the message was clear. Iran's actions had forced everyone to take a side, or at least define one. And perhaps most significantly, Tehran was winning in one arena it had long coveted but rarely dominated: the information war. Arabic-language social media platforms saw a massive surge in posts defending Iran's operation. Young users in Morocco, Egypt, and even the Gulf shared memes framing the strike as the moment the region shifted. Hashtags calling Israel's response delayed or confused trended on TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. The imagery didn't lie, or rather, it didn't need to. Perception had become its own weapon. At the same time, a strange quiet settled over Israeli air bases in the north. Satellite photos confirmed fewer flight operations, fewer nighttime maneuvers. Israeli media speculated. Was the government preparing something bigger? Or was it still figuring out how to respond? Behind the scenes, an Israeli general reportedly told a close journalist off record, "Our enemies think we're confused. Let them. But we won't forget." Across the desert, Tehran likely smiled. Because they weren't looking for applause, they were looking for acknowledgement. And with each silent shift in policy, posture, and public sentiment across the region, they got it. As April turned into May, the world's silence was no longer just a diplomatic strategy. It was a vacuum. one that echoed not just in press briefings and foreign ministry statements, but in the minds of regional leaders who had grown used to hearing the United States speak first and loudest. This time, Washington's restraint was deliberate, but to many watching, it looked like absence. At the Pentagon, daily briefings focused more on Ukraine than the Middle East. When Iran's drone footage made its way into American newsrooms, most anchors spent more time debating whether the Israeli Iron Dome had failed than asking why this happened in the first place. It was clear. The Western narrative wasn't equipped to process a Middle East where Iran set the tempo. Behind closed doors, however, U.S. officials were worried. Not about escalation, that had always been a possibility, but about irrelevance. For decades, Washington had framed itself as the indispensable power in the region. But in April 2024, not one side had waited for its approval. Tehran didn't ask for permission. Israel didn't consult before its reply. Even Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, America's closest Gulf partners, drafted their responses internally, without leaning on State Department advisors. The message was unmistakable. The region was evolving, and Washington's influence was no longer a given. Europe, meanwhile, responded with diplomatic platitudes. French President Emmanuel Macron condemned all aggression, while German officials called for a de-escalation of tensions. But those calls, stripped of action, were read for what they were: fear of involvement, not leadership. Russia's posture was more cunning. With its hands full in Ukraine, Moscow still found time to send indirect signals of support toward Tehran. Russian media, particularly RT Arabic, framed the Iranian strike as a legitimate response to years of Israeli covert aggression. The Kremlin knew the value of narrative, and in this case, Iran's story served its interests well. In Beijing, silence was a tactic. While Chinese diplomats urged calm in public, internal briefings focused on opportunity. With Western nations distracted and divided, China saw a new chance to deepen its investments and strategic ties across the Middle East, particularly with Gulf countries who now saw China as a stabilizer rather than just a financier. But the silence from one country in particular reverberated differently: the Israeli president's absence from the public eye. In Tel Aviv, as war room meetings intensified, the prime minister took the lead. But the president, usually a ceremonial figure, had remained completely out of sight since April 14th. Speculation grew. Some believed he had been relocated to a secure military facility. Others whispered that he'd left the country entirely, flown out with his family to Switzerland in a private diplomatic jet before the first drone even landed. Israeli officials denied these rumors. "The president is engaged in regular meetings," one statement read. But the public had grown skeptical. It wasn't the silence that bothered them, it was the implication. If their head of state couldn't show his face in a time like this, what did that say about the country's confidence? At the Knesset, opposition leaders seized the moment. "We told you this government was unprepared," one member shouted during a heated session. "They called us alarmists. Now the president hides, and the nation pays the price." On the streets of Jerusalem and Haifa, small protests began to take shape. Not large enough to dominate headlines, but persistent. Some called for unity, others demanded answers. And slowly, a theme began to emerge. Where are the voices we used to trust? The sense of abandonment wasn't just political, it was emotional. A generation of Israelis had grown up under the belief that no matter how bad things got, someone would step forward. A prime minister, a U.S. president, a general. A moment of clarity in chaos. But this time, clarity didn't come. Just silence. Strategic, intentional, and deeply unsettling. For Iran, this silence was a reward in itself. Each day that passed without a clear counterstrike, without a dominant global voice, strengthened Tehran's position. They had not destroyed Israel. That was never the point. They had shaken its image, rattled the hierarchy, and exposed the limits of its alliances. And yet, Iran didn't gloat. No parades in Tehran. No fiery speeches. Instead, Iranian state media kept a calm tone, highlighting defensive strength and regional independence. The restraint was calculated. They knew the world was watching for arrogance. Instead, they projected control. But beneath the optics, a different truth took shape. The Middle East had entered a new phase. One where perception could outweigh firepower, and silence could say more than strategy. In that silence, Iran's message echoed. We're no longer in your shadow. We're on your level. And for a region long ruled by loud declarations, that quiet might have been the loudest shift of all. When dawn broke over central Iran on April 19th, locals in Isfahan awoke to a sound they couldn't quite place. Not an explosion, but something more subtle, a shudder in the air, a quick flicker of light, then stillness. Within hours, satellite images would confirm what Tehran refused to acknowledge. Israel had struck back. But this wasn't a large-scale retaliation. There was no leveling of missile factories, no televised barrages, or prolonged air raids. Instead, Israel targeted a specific air defense radar facility on the outskirts of Isfahan, a military site with strategic value, but far from densely populated areas or major political symbols. The message was precise. We can reach you. We're choosing not to escalate, for now. Iran's state media initially denied the incident. No damage reported, no injuries confirmed. Just unusual aerial activity, followed by claims that all hostile threats had been neutralized. But international observers, including U.S. intelligence sources, confirmed that the strike had indeed taken place. It had been surgical, almost clinical. A demonstration, not a declaration. For Israel, the decision to hit Isfahan, and only Isfahan, was a gamble. The military had contingency plans for broader operations, but the prime minister, facing a volatile domestic scene and international pressure for restraint, opted for symbolism over destruction. The reasoning was clear. If Israel launched a massive retaliatory strike, Iran would have justification, or perhaps obligation, to respond in kind. That could lead to open war, which neither side was ready to wage. Instead, Israel needed to prove two things: that it hadn't been caught flat-footed, and that it still held escalation dominance. In a statement later that evening, an Israeli defense official phrased it carefully. The state of Israel reserves the right to defend itself, at a time and manner of its choosing. Today's action was proportionate and measured. To the Israeli public, the response landed with mixed results. Some saw it as a sign of control, a disciplined answer to an unprecedented provocation. Others, particularly among the more hardline factions, criticized it as weak. They humiliated us in front of the world, one former cabinet member said in a radio interview. And we sent a warning shot. At military bases across the country, troops remained on high alert. Reserves were still mobilized. The Iron Dome and David Sling systems continued to track the skies. The sense of vulnerability hadn't faded, even with Israel's limited retaliation. But globally, Israel's approach found some validation. In Washington, senior officials privately breathed a sigh of relief. The Biden administration had feared a spiraling conflict, not just between Israel and Iran, but potentially drawing in proxies across Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Israel's surgical strike gave them space to maintain their stance. Firm support for Israeli defense, without being dragged into a broader regional war. European leaders echoed that sentiment. The UK's Foreign Secretary praised the precision and restraint of Israel's actions. Germany called it an example of responsible leadership under pressure. Even NATO, typically cautious about non-member conflicts, issued a rare statement of support for Israel's measured defense. In Tehran, the response was carefully muted. Officials downplayed the incident, referring to it as an enemy attempt that was intercepted. But analysts noted the language shift: no fiery threats, no promises of swift retribution. Iran, too, seemed intent on avoiding escalation, at least in the immediate term. That didn't mean the game was over. Far from it. What had begun with Operation True Promise had now entered a colder, quieter phase, a contest of patience, perception, and positioning. Iran had claimed initiative, shattered a taboo, and forced Israel into a new kind of response, not fire for fire, but fire for message. And in that message, both sides were recalibrating their red lines. For Iran, The April 13th to 14th strike wasn't about defeating Israel militarily. It was about proving it could bypass regional proxies and act directly, that it could strike Israeli soil, even Jerusalem, and survive the political fallout, that its military doctrine had evolved beyond deterrence into strategic provocation. For Israel, the Isfahan strike was equally symbolic, a demonstration that precision could still carry weight, that Israel could respond without taking the bait, and that while it may have been caught off guard, it hadn't lost its grip. But in the eyes of their respective populations, both governments were now under new scrutiny. The people of Israel demanded answers about readiness, about deterrence, about leadership. The people of Iran, meanwhile, questioned whether their government's gamble had brought strength or danger to their doorsteps. In the broader Middle East, allies and adversaries alike took note. Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha all watched closely. The region had grown used to proxy dynamics, to back channels and deniable operations. Now, direct confrontation had become possible. Not inevitable, but thinkable. And once something becomes thinkable, it changes everything. By late April 2024, the shockwaves from the Israel-Iran exchange had traveled far beyond the Middle East. In Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris, foreign ministries worked overtime, not just managing public statements, but fielding private calls from intelligence chiefs, defense officials, and diplomats asking the same question in different words. How far would this go? In the days following Israel's surgical strike on Isfahan, there was a rare consensus across Western capitals that the response had been unexpectedly limited, and perhaps wisely so. But that didn't mean the crisis was over. In fact, it had only shifted into a more dangerous phase, one where misinterpretation or political pressure could turn restraint into escalation overnight. For U.S. policymakers, the situation presented a tightrope walk. The United States has long stood as Israel's most powerful ally, offering military support, intelligence coordination, and diplomatic backing in nearly every major conflict. But the direct confrontation between Israel and Iran in April 2024 introduced a new variable, the possibility that American interests could be drawn into a regional war with no clear boundaries. President Biden, speaking from the White House Rose Garden, reaffirmed America's support for Israel's right to self-defense. But he also emphasized the need for measured responses and avoiding a wider conflict. It was a careful balance, signaling to Tehran that the U.S. was watching, while reassuring Israel that it wasn't being abandoned. Privately, the administration pushed both sides to stand down. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made calls to Israeli and Qatari intermediaries, while defense officials communicated through Swiss and Omani channels to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The message was clear. Neither side had anything to gain from prolonging this crisis. In Europe, the approach was similar but more cautious. France's President Macron warned of a cascade effect if cooler heads didn't prevail. Germany's Chancellor spoke of Europe's moral responsibility to de-escalate. The United Kingdom, while reaffirming solidarity with Israel, also sent quiet signals to Tehran through diplomatic channels, urging restraint and offering to mediate. But despite the united tone, there were cracks beneath the surface. Some European officials voiced concern that their countries had become too dependent on the stability of the Gulf for energy. With oil prices spiking and trade routes in the Strait of Hormuz under renewed scrutiny, economic stability suddenly hinged on diplomatic success. Meanwhile, Gulf nations found themselves in a complex position. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, while not close to Iran, had spent the past few years cautiously repairing ties with Tehran to focus on economic growth and regional influence. The Israel-Iran clash threatened to undo those delicate efforts. Riyadh, in particular, found itself caught between historical rivalry with Iran and its recent outreach efforts. Publicly, Saudi officials condemned the Iranian strikes on Israel, calling them reckless and destabilizing. But behind the scenes, Saudi diplomats urged restraint from both parties, recognizing that another war in the region would disrupt Vision 2030, the kingdom's ambitious plan to diversify its economy and reduce oil dependency. In Tel Aviv, Israeli officials understood the calculus. Their intelligence network tracked not just Iranian missile activity, but also the diplomatic winds blowing from every major capital. They knew that their restraint had bought them political capital, but also that this support was conditional. If Israel escalated too far, it risked losing the very allies that had protected it on the world stage. Inside Iran, the leadership faced its own internal tensions. The Revolutionary Guard favored a hardline response to the Isfahan strike. But the civilian leadership, including President Ebrahim Raisi, appeared to favor consolidation over escalation, using the moment to rally domestic support and portray Iran as both bold and rational. State-run media broadcast images of mass rallies, with chants echoing across Tehran. "We answered the Zionists. We stood our ground." But behind the slogans, the regime quietly issued orders to its regional proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shiite militias in Iraq, to stand down for now. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Tehran had gained a propaganda victory, proving it could hit Israel directly and survive. It didn't need an all-out war to reinforce that point. More importantly, it had made its move in a way that exposed vulnerabilities in Israel's air defense and planted doubt among the public about future threats. The irony? Both Israel and Iran walked away from that week claiming victory, and yet both knew they had barely avoided disaster. And for their allies, that contradiction made support all the more complicated. In the corridors of the Pentagon, senior analysts began running new simulations. What if Iran's next move wasn't a barrage, but a cyber attack? What if Israel responded not with planes, but through Mossad-backed sabotage on Iranian soil? The future conflicts weren't just about missiles anymore. They could be fought through energy markets, data centers, or international law. By the time April turned to May, a fragile calm had settled, but no one mistook it for peace. It was more like a chess match, played in shadows and press conferences. One wrong move, one misread signal, and the next exchange might not be so limited. By early May 2024, the skies over Tehran and Tel Aviv were quiet, but no one believed it was over. The missiles were no longer flying, but the impact continued in less visible, more insidious ways, politically, socially, and psychologically. In Israel, the population remained on edge. Air raid sirens had gone silent, but the uncertainty was louder than ever. Families that had spent nights in bomb shelters returned to homes where every creak of the ceiling now felt like a warning. Children were having trouble sleeping. Supermarkets kept shelves stocked with emergency supplies. And political talk shows aired heated debates about deterrence, retaliation, and the government's moral responsibility. Prime Minister Netanyahu stood before the Knesset and described Israel's military conduct as strategic brilliance, a limited response that avoided a wider war, while reaffirming Israel's capabilities. His speech was met with applause from allies and quiet disapproval from others who believed he had blinked in the face of direct aggression. For some within Israel's security establishment, the lack of a decisive retaliation felt like unfinished business. Yet beneath the political bravado, there was a growing awareness. Iran had crossed a threshold that few thought possible. It had struck Israeli territory directly, not through proxies, not in the shadows. And while the damage was minimal compared to what might have been, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in Iran, state media celebrated Operation True Promise as a national victory. News anchors repeated the same phrase over and over: "We hit them, and they could not stop us." Crowds in Tehran marched in orchestrated displays of support, waving flags and burning effigies. But within more private circles, the discussion was far more nuanced. Iran's elite knew the exchange had pushed them closer to a red line. The attack had been bold, yes, but it also revealed gaps in Iran's air defense, vulnerabilities in their communication networks, and a disturbing proximity to full-scale retaliation. The question among senior Iranian officials was no longer whether they could strike Israel again. It was whether the nation could withstand the consequences if Israel decided to strike back harder. The global reaction remained tense and polarized. While some international figures praised the restraint shown by both sides after the initial exchange, others warned of how close the world had come to witnessing a catastrophic regional war, one that could have pulled in superpowers on opposing ends. At the United Nations, a flurry of emergency sessions failed to yield any binding resolutions, but they did showcase the sharp geopolitical divides still at play. Russia blamed Israel for provoking the crisis through previous covert actions. China urged both parties to de-escalate and called for a new security architecture in the region. The U.S. and its allies continued to defend Israel's right to respond, but their tone had shifted from unflinching support to cautious pragmatism. What had started as a night of flashing skies and roaring engines had now morphed into a war of narratives. Each side tried to claim moral high ground. Iran painted itself as a victim that responded proportionally to decades of provocation. Israel framed its retaliation as a necessary act of defense, delivered with precision and discipline. The truth lay somewhere in the tension between those claims, in the silences, the casualties not shown, the families quietly grieving behind closed doors. Back in the U.S., think tanks and military analysts began publishing long reports on the April escalation. Some framed it as a strategic case study. Others warned it was just the opening chapter of a much longer, more dangerous confrontation. Cable news quickly moved on, distracted by new headlines. But the communities most directly affected, Israeli towns near the Golan Heights, Iranian cities close to military installations, did not forget so easily. For them, the fear wasn't hypothetical. Even among allies, there was unease about what had truly changed. Would Iran's boldness now encourage similar moves by other regional actors? Would Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis grow more aggressive, emboldened by Tehran's precedent? Would Israel be forced to preempt the next strike, even before it came? And hanging over all of it was a deeper question, not of military strategy, but of humanity. What happens when deterrence fails not because of weakness, but because the other side no longer fears the consequences? As the dust settled, a strange irony emerged. The calm that followed felt less like peace, and more like a reset clock. One that could start ticking again at any moment. In the final analysis, April 2024 didn't mark the end of anything. It marked a turning point, a moment when lines were crossed, gloves were removed, and the rules of engagement were redefined. It showed the world that in the modern Middle East, conflict no longer requires a declaration. It just needs a window, a message, and a reason. And as the world watched, some in fear, others in fascination, one truth remained clear. Next time, no one will be surprised.